Hello, and welcome to the first podcast of the second season for the episode Scattered. I'm Ronald D. Moore, executive producer and developer of the new Battlestar Galactica. Thank you all for tuning in and for listening to the podcasts, which we'll try to continue to do for as much of the second season as I possibly can. This episode of Battlestar Galactica, to kick off Season 2, underwent a great deal of changes along the way, all the way from concept on to final broadcast. Initially, we had a different plan to open the second season. Instead of doing a direct pickup on the cliffhanger ending from last season's finale, Cobalt's Last Gleaming, I wanted to do something a little different and not come back directly to the cliffhanger and actually do a completely separate sort of episode that was an episode set in some time in the distant past. I won't tell you too many details about that episode because it's still sort of on the drawing boards and something that we're considering doing at a later date. But in essence, what is now Scattered and the subsequent episode 2, Valley of Darkness, were actually going to be episode number 2. And then as it worked out, we decided not to go that way and decided to open Season 2 a little bit more traditionally with a direct pickup into the cliffhanger. That said, Scattered really wasn't going to... I didn't want Scattered to directly pick up the cliffhanger still. I was still kind of like fighting against that notion and wanted to really kind of subvert the audience's expectations of what we were going to do. And the episode in script form actually picked up or opened with an open scene in a bar on Caprica 20 years ago. And you just kind of cut into this scene with, it was a bar filled with a lot of people, televisions on in the background, giving commentary on pyramid games, etc. And you went over and there was Colonel Tigh at the bar, a much younger Colonel Tigh with hair, and he was doodling, a Viper weapon systems on a napkin, and some guys came in. You realized that they were crewmen from another merchant freighter that he was on, and they were taunting him in some way, and a fight broke out. And the fight got pretty ugly, and Colonel Tigh ultimately has a man down and is about to break his neck when another man rushes up behind him and is about to hit him with a bottle and possibly kill him, and you hear the sound of a shotgun, and you pan off, and there's Adama. And this was how Adama and Tigh first met. They met in a bar in between the wars. The backstory to the series is that the initial Cylon conflict was fought 40 years ago. And in that war, both Tigh and Adama were young men who did not fight together. They were fought in separate ways on separate vessels, had separate experiences. And after the war was over, both men were discharged, along with many other service people, out into the civilian world, and they both sort of happened to sign up aboard the same civilian sort of tramp freighter that was plying the trade routes among the colonies, and that was how they met. In any case, that's how I wanted to open this episode. We were going to open this show with just that scene and show how the two men met, and then come into the scene you're watching now, where Tigh takes command of Galactica, and Adama has been shot, and there's all this chaos. And the episode was going to continue to sort of flash back onto their relationship of the early days of Tigh and Adama, and how the two men met, what they meant to each other, what it was that Adama saw in Tigh for the first time, and sort of really go through the creation of the friendship, and counterpointing that with events in the current day Galactica, where Adama's life hangs in the balance, and Tigh is making decisions based in part on things that he learned from Adama way back in those days. And we shot those sequences. Those sequences were shot and edited together, and we looked at them, but ultimately we didn't like them. We just didn't feel... They weren't quite the show, frankly. And really not through any... You can't really point your finger at any particular person, except, maybe me, because it was my concept. And, I don't know that I created or had the writers of this episode, Bradley, Thompson, and David Weddle, I don't know that I gave them really a rich enough environment to really tell that backstory. In any case, when we watched the cut, we all kind of felt, and the director included, that it would just be a better story to tell the tale in a more linear fashion and that we would still use that material, still use the flashback material that we had, but instead of making it these objective points of view, we were going to change them into subjective points of view. That is, we would tie them directly into Tigh's experience. They would be from Tigh's memories instead of sort of the audience watching the events happen as if you were just cutting back in time. We would tie them all to Colonel Tigh specifically. So as you watch the show, you'll see that there are many places where we're going directly off of Tigh. You're creating these flashbacks now in a subjective way. Tigh is thinking about Adama. You can see it subliminally there in the teaser. He's thinking about Adama on the table. He's remembering the moment he met Adama. It's informing his decision now. So it really kind of changed the tenor of the episode. Instead of it being sort of this sort of dramatic device that was sort of counterpointing present-day reality with past events, it became more of a character study of Colonel Tigh, because now you're sort of going inside Colonel Tigh's head and sort of, living with him his experiences as seen through the prism of his relationship with Adama. Now I apologize because my DVD my DVD copy of Scattered is screwing up slightly. So it's freezing periodically, and I'm having a little trouble. I think it's my home system more than anything else. My handy-dandy home system that I just got. In any case, I am now at the section where the fleet is jumping away, in any case. Dual is just saying, jump. There we go. Okay, so the roots of this story, even before the cliffhanger, this idea that the fleet would be lost and scattered across a vast section, is actually something that predates season 2. It's actually something that was in one of the first log lines for the series way back when I was sending up a list of potential storylines to the network, saying that these are the shows that we would do if you take us to series, and on them were ideas like 33. The idea that the Cylons come back every 33 minutes was one of them. The riot aboard the prison ship was one of them, and the fact that there would be a jump and the fleet would be scattered across a vast expanse was one of them. This is slightly different in that instead of all the ships of the fleet being scattered and lost, it's essentially that Galactica is really the one that's been lost. It's that Galactica has jumped to a different location than the rest of the fleet. You'll notice I'm in the main title sequence here. The main title sequence, you'll note, has changed this year. We have lopped off the second part, the sort of upcoming scenes section with the drum beats and all that, in favor of keeping the beginning and making it a little bit shorter. And I'll talk a little bit more of that when we come back on Act 1, and hopefully my DVD will continue to function. Boom, Galactica. Okay, Act 1. As I was saying before I get into the Baltar 6 stuff that you're seeing now, we also changed the main title theme back to the UK version, which was always sort of the preference of the producers and everyone on the show, and there was some internal debate about which was the best main title, what's the best theme music. I think at the end of the day, basically everybody agreed that the theme that we had season 1 was not as evocative and interesting as sort of the UK version, so we all agreed to do that. The reason behind losing the second half was sort of to just make the whole thing a little faster, to get through the main title a little quicker. And also, there were complaints. Some people just don't like seeing scenes from the upcoming show. I mean, I really dug it. I was always a big proponent of it and really liked it. I know that David Icke, my partner, also loved it too. But there were legitimate people that just said, "Well, we don't want to be spoiled. We don't want to see the scenes that we're coming up on." So we decided to lose it. So there's David and Bradley, who wrote the episode, and we're back in Baltar's head down on Cobalt. One of the interesting things about this season, in the way that this all begins, is that there were so many plot threads to sort of pick up from last season, from the end of Cobalt. And we made the decision very early on. I really did not want to wrap all the storylines up in a nice, neat little package in the first hour It didn't feel right. It didn't feel it would work within the parameters of the reality we've created, and it was just far less interesting to try to bring all these people back to Galactica and get them back to where they were, sort of hit the reset button, as it were. So we really opted to sort of tease out this storyline. And the storyline kept getting bigger. I mean, I think initially there were going to be 5 episodes that would be dedicated to all these plot threads of the people on Kobol, Kara and Caprica, and the people on Galactica, and Laura not being president and Adama being shot. All those things I think were initially going to be resolved in one way or another by the time we got to like episode 5. As we started developing these scripts, 2 of the scripts just became unmanageable as single 1-hour episodes, and this is one of them. Scattered initially. Oh, and as a side note, if you're listening to this, I hope you're into being spoiled, because we're going to be talking about not just things coming up in this episode, but things coming up in subsequent episodes. So, fair warning, there will be spoilers given away here. Scattered had encompassed in its storyline not only, it just had this entire piece of material in that most of the action that was going to be in what is now the second episode in Valley of Darkness, most of that storyline was also in Scattered. All the action that takes place on Kobol in Valley of Darkness, having to do with what you'll see in that one is the death of well, I just gave it away. But in essence, what happens to Socinis in part 2 was all going to be in Scattered. What happens to Kara and Hilo in the second episode was also going to be in Scattered. The eventual sort of wrap up of all the events on Galactica was going to be on Scattered, but we just couldn't do it. It was too many things to manage in a 1-hour episode. And we've always sort of struggled with the length of our scripts and the length of our episodes. There's only, if you look at it, there's really only about 40 minutes and change of actual program content. And our scripts tend to run in the early drafts. They're always in the 50s. Usually we like them to be in the low 50s, 51, 52, 53. 60-page scripts are not unheard of. An ideal page script for us going into shooting is usually around 46, 47 pages. Sometimes we make that, sometimes we don't. But even when we make that, and I think we did on Scattered, I think in the final draft of Scattered, I think it was around 47, 48 pages, the shows are still too huge. They're still too long. The style of storytelling, I might have talked about this before, just requires, spending more time on character, creating moments, really sort of taking your time as you go through the show. And that just expands. And so Scattered in its initial draft was just much too big to sustain one episode. So we essentially divided it into 2 and created another action storyline for part 2, which is Valley of Darkness, which, as you'll see at the end of this show, the Cylons are on the ship. The Cylons have boarded Galactica, and that's sort of our cliffhanger ending for episode 1. And then that becomes the primary action storyline of part 2. But all the other tales that happen in part 2, apart from the Cylon boarding, were actually all supposed to be in Scattered, and there was just no way that the show could really support that. It was just too much to have to deal with. So we split them into 2 shows. Similar thing happened with episode 6, which was going to be the place where all the storylines were kind of wrapped up, and Laura was, eventually restored to the presidency, and Adama's back, and everyone kind of gets back home. Episode 6 became much too large to sustain 1 hour as well, so we split that into 2. So now, essentially, Season 1 and the storylines that began in Season 1 don't really end until Episode 7 of the second season, which is great. I mean, it's in a way, that's like we have a 20-episode first season, if you want to think about it like that. Okay, back to what we're dealing with here. This is, Lee and Laura and their sort of troubled and conflicted relationship now that Lee has, sided. Lee very dramatically sided with Laura aboard Colonial 1 last season, and Laura did not back him up, and I think that embittered him in certain ways and creates tension in their relationship because, Lee was expecting, her to be there for him. He put a gun to Tigh's head, and then she immediately sort of went, okay, I can't do this. I can't have colonial officers shooting each other. This has gone too far. She has to stop. All these scenes on Kobol, as are all the show scenes, are shot in Vancouver. You'll note that Cobalt looks greener and more lush, and the color's a little bit more saturated. This is a great piece of editing right there. That's actually 2 different pieces of film, but it's really wonderfully done. All the scenes on Cobalt are shot obviously in Vancouver, but so are all the scenes in Caprica. And it's really a question about how you light it and how you digitally color time these shots to make them feel like 2 different planets. And our DP, Steve, is very, very talented and has been able to sort of deliver 2 completely sort of different looks to what is essentially the same basic group of locations. I mean, if you look at this location closely, and you went back and looked in the first season in say episode 1, 33, and episode 2, Water, the scenes on Caprica, they were shot in very similar terrain with very similar trees, very similar foliage. It's not that different. What is different is the way he chooses to light and shoot these scenes, which gives you a vibe and a feeling that you are in different environments. Caprica is sort of theoretically undergoing some kind of nuclear winter, or at least drastic climate changes. So it tends the lighting scheme there tends to be much more blown out, much more sort of ghastly, for lack of a better word. Whereas here on Cobalt, the once home of humanity, where it was once paradise, it's a much more vibrant, verdant kind of green environment, very sort of Garden of Eden type. This storyline of what happens to the people down in Cobalt is really one of my favorites of this season. It's a really interesting tale of this raptor, the survivors of the raptor crash, led by Sam Witwer, who plays Crashdown, who was a small character that we established in 33 last season. We needed a guy to replace Hilo, because Sharon was a Raptor pilot, and a Raptor's piloted by 2 people. So Sharon needed to fly with somebody, and we needed another character. So I came up with this guy Crashdown. And the initial stories on Crashdown were very small. He was supposed to be a little funnier, a little more of a joker. Didn't take things quite as serious, and sort of looked a bit buffoonish and silly in some sequences. But we really grew to like him and to like Sam over the course of the year, and started to use him more and more. Sam's a very talented actor, very dedicated to the profession, and really interesting guy. And by the time we got to Cobalt's Last Gleaming, and this party had gone down, I didn't really know where this story was going, but I was fascinated with the idea that Crashdown would be in command of an what has become essentially an infantry unit. There are troops down on the ground, and that Tyrrell would be his chief petty officer, who starts to lose faith in him, and that Crashdown is not really up to that task, as dedicated as he is as a character, and as much as he wants to lead those men. He finds that there are many shortcomings that he can't quite handle, and it's a dark tale of what happens to those people on Cobalt, and I just think it's wonderful. And I'll come back to that later. We're back on Caprica. You can already see that the color tones here on Caprica, even though this is an interior, are very different. It's much more yellows and golden, and just sort of a different color scheme. That brief shot of the exterior of the museum was much more blown out. The color hues are much different than what you saw in Caprica. There was some debate internally about, when we saw these dailies, about how much blood was on Katee's face in this sequence. There were some people that were going, God, there's so much blood. Why didn't she wipe off her face? You just look so horrible and scary and awful. And personally, I love it. I think she looks great in this whole sequence. The fact that she's got blood all over her face from the fight with Six, it just sort of speaks to the violence of the world that she's living in, and how desperate things have become, and her raw emotions, and her anger towards Sharon. And I mean, this is an interesting dynamic. He's in love with the enemy now and is trying to protect the enemy, but he's still a colonial officer. She just got here and knows immediately that Sharon is not one of us, and knows that she has to die. I mean, it's a great sort of very sort of operatic in many ways kind of storyline. This was all shot, I think at the same location we shot Cobalt's Last Gleaming at, as I recall. We had to go back in. It was very difficult to get back into these locations one more time. That's the shot I really like. I really like her in that angle with the blood and the grime and just the look in on her face. I think she looks great, actually, in a twisted, odd kind of way. I think she's really attractive in this whole scene, which might speak to my own strangeness more than anything, any objective reality. As I said, this is really the only sequence, the only Caprica sequence in part one. And it was, that was because we only had a few Caprica scenes to sort of go over both parts. And we felt like we needed, I think the second scene of, that's great. And this is my... I threw that line out like in a meeting and everybody just liked it and I just kept laughing when I said it. Okay, we're going to go to part 2, Act 2 now. Okay, now we're in Act 2. Just to finish that thought, there was a second scene on Caprica in Scattered, but we felt it was better. It was a better scene to use in part 2 in Valley of Darkness. So we moved it editorially into that episode. So as a result, there's only one Caprica scene here. This whole bit of business, that's actually Jamie Bamber's wife, who's playing the medic. Here you see, these are the flashbacks I'm talking about. There were entire scenes that took place in the past where they talked about the relationship. Adama had come back in and kept him from killing another man and alluded to the fact that Tigh drinks too much and that they both want to get back into the fleet. And that was the driving force, that Tigh had given up any hope of putting on a colonial uniform again, and Adama never had. Adama was determined that he was going to get back into the fleet. Part of the problem, I think, with the flashbacks, when you just watch them as objective cuts, as opposed to these sort of more stylized pieces, was that we could only go so far in aging down the actors. We didn't want to get into heavy prosthetic to try to make them look younger, because that starts to become its own sort of artifice where you age them down and add so much prosthetic makeup to them that it looks false, and then the digitally doing it is incredibly expensive. So part of the problem was they didn't look as young as we needed them to, but we didn't want to just recast with younger actors, even though in an early draft we did say that. We were talking about having young Tigh and young Adama. And then you just go, well, why are we doing this? You don't want to lose Eddie and Michael. That's the whole point of doing the flashbacks. So, it's another reason why the flashbacks are just more effective as sort of stylized pieces. This sort of just quiet walk around of Sharon, I think, is just great. I love this moment that the two Michaels, Michael Hogan and Michael Rymer, created here. Sharon's fear, Tigh's, anger, hatred, loathing, fear, concern, confusion. What is this thing? I can't believe it's Sharon. And then, ooh, that's gotta hurt. I like this scene a lot. It's a dark scene. It's a dark show. I mean, this is what would really happen, though, in my opinion. This is how these characters would behave. Tigh would not take a lot of guff off. Tigh doesn't take a lot of guff off of anybody, much less Sharon Valeri, who just shot the old man. Oof. Oof. And there's those flashes of the number 3 on the door. Now, in a couple of cuts at that very moment, see, right now there's a stylized piece. He remembers the door, which is a recurring motif throughout the show. That's, what's the door about? What's the door? What's the door? And then he sees a flash of Adama. In a few cuts of this, we made it a more literal flashback, where Adama had literally stopped him from killing another man in the past when Tigh was drunk, and Adama warned him that someday you're going to kill someone and you're not going to be able to call it back. You're not going to, it'll be too late, and I won't be your friend anymore. He says kind of sardonically, and Tigh says, "Yeah, that'd be a fracking shame." And then you came back to the Sharon scene. It was a little too literal. It was a little too on the nose. It kind of delivered the message hit you over the head with the message a little bit too much. So this is a much better version. that Andy, our editor, cut, where it's just subliminal and you know that there's meaning to it, and that there's a bit of something from Tigh's subconscious and his past is sort of, slowing him down and keeping him from putting a bullet in Sharon's head right there. This sequence actually, we in looking for cuts, we tightened that significantly. There was a Cylon attack there where they started taking fire, and they barely got away. And then you cut here still. This is all sort of improvised dialogue, actually, that the actors came up with as they chatted back and forth. There was something else scripted, but the actors went way off book here, and with Michael worked out another little piece of banter, which worked out really nicely. That's great. This is the kind of sequence you don't often really see, I think, where it's just the bolt from the blue attack that takes out somebody, that you've started to form a relationship with, and you're just under fire. I like the sound design and all. This is sort of flat echo of the gunshots out in the forest. Feels very realistic. I like the fact that this is not like scored with some giant, orchestral pulse-pounding sequence, which would tell you that it's all okay on some level because, hey, there's music, there's action music. It's the agony of actually being shot. It's the terror of where are those guys out there. There's Callie squeezing off rounds. It's it's just great. I like this sequence a lot. It's a powerful one. It feels very raw. It's like they're out there, and man, the Cylons are out there too. And again, like I said, the Cobalt storyline is one of my favorites because it just feels like we're dealing with real things that happen to real people, and things don't always go well for real people. We had trouble figuring out how to editorially get from the previous scene to this scene for quite some time. A lot of times the scripts are written one way in a certain structure. In the editing room, you play around with exactly where certain sequences fall and how you get from A to B. And there were several cuts where we had those two scenes on top of each other, where you did sort of a dissolve or a quick cut that they had just gotten away. And we had a different Act 1 ending at some point, or whichever act that was, it just ended Act 2. And we shifted things around to make that the act break, and then you could kind of come back here. This is an effective little moment, I feel, He's just a guy you barely know, but you did start to know him, and you try to rescue him, and you pull him out of the line of fire, and he dies anyway. Because that really happens. War's an ugly, bad thing. And for all the heroics of it and all the noble causes that can be associated with it and the camaraderie, these things happen. It's death. It's ugly death. It's death that comes up to people that don't deserve it and people that do. And I like that. I like the fact that, our characters have emotions. They're not just sort of stoic. They don't just take death in stride like so many people on TV do and just move on, and just step over the body. It's a tough world you live in, kid, and move on. It's Callie that's trying to pull the chief off of there. It's not the other way around. Callie's not collapsing in tears and hysterics. Callie's got the med kit and the backpack, and she's got the mission, and it's the chief that has to be pulled away from his man. Which I think is wonderful, and I think it says a lot of great things about the innate humanity of these characters in the world of Galactica. Gaeta, who's still feeling sort of the guilt associated with screwing up and letting the fleet get lost. It's just this too is a great little beat. It's not much dialogue. It's just character. We've started to find that these two, over time, Gaeta and Duala, have developed their own sort of relationship, and that, it's an interesting sort of, these are the guys that are not in charge, the guys that carry out orders, and they have their own sort of shorthand and sort of ease, even though there's a gulf between them as a lieutenant and a petty officer. The bit of the soap. And I remember, I think I added this little piece that Gaeta lines up the pieces of soap and gets an idea. It's just a nice little, easy to understand gag, then on we go. And then we're into a bit of the techno-babble, which, no science fiction show would be without. It's hard stuff to write, it's unpleasant stuff to watch and film, and somehow you still need it. Every once in a while you still got to do these kind of gags where just to explain what the the hell the idea is. You got to go into this kind of mumbo jumbo jargon. We try to keep it to a bare minimum. At Star Trek, when I was working at Star Trek, there were times when we just had pages and pages of this kind of dialogue. I've probably ranted about this before on other podcasts, so forgive me if I'm really just, if this is becoming a hobby horse. But I think a lot of science fiction, filmed science fiction, and film and television falls down on this front, where there's just too much emphasis on all this sort of gobbledygook stuff that doesn't exist and doesn't matter ultimately, because it's really about the characters. It's about what choices they're going to make. And for those of you who's listened to these podcasts before, it would be no surprise to you that the gardeners have decided to work across the street on the day I'm doing the podcast here in lovely Southern California. This is a sequence. Now here you can see much more of the flashback. That shot right there, this one of Tigh that we've just slowed down, is actually stolen from another episode. In the editing room, we were I wanted desperately to have another moment of flashback where we would get a little bit more of their backstory and see more of what happened to the two men. And I needed a transitional element into it, and nothing really worked. It didn't have a piece of Tigh by himself in a corridor or anywhere else that I could really key off of to sort of start this flashback, because again, these are subjective flashbacks, so I sort of needed a Tigh piece. So those shots right there of him walking in the corridor are actually stolen from the end of episode 4, Resistance. And I went into the editing room as they were cutting 4, and I was asking for a shot. Is there somebody got a shot of Tigh walking alone in the corridor wearing the blue uniform? And sure enough, there was a piece. And those shots are actually stolen from the very end of Resistance. We had to cut around very carefully so that we don't repeat the shots in episode 4. But when you watch episode 4 and you see Tigh walk off down the corridor at the end of that show, you'll see where those scenes are actually cut from. The beat that you just saw a moment ago of Tigh going in and getting Apollo's parole so that Apollo can go fly the mission and be the CAG is actually an idea that sort of dates back to, ironically enough, Hornblower for me. And of course, some of you may or may not know that Jamie Bamber was in the A&E miniseries of Hornblower. And Hornblower, Hornblower is one of my favorite books as a kid. It's still some of my very favorite books of all time. And then there was this whole notion of parole. When there was a point where Hornblower was a British naval officer, was captured by the French and was held prisoner. But as an officer and a gentleman of that time, he would give his parole so that he could walk out and be free for a time. And parole essentially meant his word, his promise that while he was out walking and taking in the sea and not being confined to his cell, he promised he would not try to escape. And there's a great shot. This is one of those great shots that Gary Hutzel brings in and Zoic has created. I believe it's Zoic. That wows everybody. And we go, oh my God, that's the show. And I'll come back here in a second. Okay, now we're in the big action sequence of Act 4. A couple of these shots. There's not many recycled shots. That was one from the miniseries. That's another from the miniseries. This whole sequence is really, in my opinion, is one of the best visual effects sequences I've been associated with. It's just, that's a new shot. These are repeats of existing shots. That's a new shot off towards the Cylons. There's a sort of interesting thing going on here that some of the writers did not like, actually. This dialogue in the cockpits between Cat and Flyboy, or Cat and Hot Dog, etc., and the rest of them, as they're sort of eager for the battle and going into it with a different sort of point of view. Some of the comments came back that, some of the writers felt, David and Bradley felt, frankly, that it was really sort of out of context, that it was wrong for them to go out into the battle, given with that kind of sort of high spirit and competitive streak, given that Adama's life is hanging in the balance and so many serious things have happened. And I understand that point of view. I mean, my initial reaction when I saw it was surprise too, and at first I didn't like it either. And they'd shot two versions of that whole sequence, where one that as scripted, which was much more matter of fact, and then one that was more like this. And I started to really like this version because it sort of widened, it opened the world up a little bit more. It told me that there was a different story going on down in the pilot ready rooms and in their cockpits and in their world that really wasn't connected with the rest of the show. And I liked the fact that they weren't involved in the A story. They weren't involved in Adama's life. They weren't involved in all these other things, that they were doing their own thing. Here's the new Heavy Raider. And now we start getting into really, I think, just amazing stuff. This upcoming sequence when they go in on Galactica's flak cloud, I think is amazing. Spin around. We're going to go after these guys. There goes Kat. She comes around. And there's Galactica off in the distance. These are just great shots. And there's this little interlude here, which was much bigger, which was longer in other cuts, but this is really all you need to sell this story, is this sort of emergence of some people starting to look to Laura Roslin as a prophet and a religious figure, and her sort of reluctant embrace of that role. It was a story thread that I did not want to lose as we went through all this. This sort of ethereal sound cue. It's hard to make these attack sequences more interesting, I think. As you do more and more of them, attacks on Galactica, you start repeating yourself and trying to do the same shots. And, what do you do to make it more interesting? And Gary and his team, really came through for us in this. I mean, it's just a really outstanding job. This sequence, it's just not something that I've seen before as they go in. I mean, the idea that Galactica has a flak cloud that wards off missiles and incoming raiders, and it's like this really dense ack that's flying around the ship, and it's a great concept and it makes perfect sense. But it's hard. It's never really been visualized like this. Here we go. I mean, we're coming right up into it. They come down. You can kind of see it. There's the flak cloud forming. Look at that. It's like we're just shooting back. All these, there's a certain MASH kind of quality to these operating scenes, which I really like. And this is when I start to really love it. That shot, Lee strike. Look at that! Look at that! That's unbelievable. That is such a complicated, beautiful shot. I mean, that is really, really amazing stuff. That's just unbelievable. Look at what he's flying into, and then this shot. Whoa. It's just great. And then we have yet more. The shot of the Heavy Raider plunging into the flight pod. Now, the thing to remember here is that flight pod, for those of you in the know, is where the museum was. That's not the active flight pod. And there's a window, you can see its wreckage, but nobody's over there. I mean, it's an empty part of the ship, and they've taken a hit over there and an impact, but policies there's no fire, no damage. The assumption is that a ship crashed into the pod and was destroyed, and they're still in the middle of combat and battle, and they're rushing around, and this is an undermanned crew. I mean, which is all essentially rationale to explain why they don't know that they've been boarded until the next episode. And it's, you could say it's a shaky logic, but there is a logic to it, and I think it does work. So now we're back, which is great because it's great to know that Colonel Tigh did guide them successfully through this crisis, which is a salute to his character and the fact that Adama did see something of value in him, that there was a reason why Adama brought this man back into the fleet and kept him by his side for many years. And in light of subsequent episodes to this, when things are going to go from bad to worse under Tigh's leadership, it was really important to see that Tigh, in a crisis, in a combat situation, in a wartime scenario, is the guy you do want at the command. He can get you through that, and he will guide them successfully through this episode and through Valley of Darkness, because when the Cylons are on the ship, Tigh knows what to do about that. And it's only after the guns start shooting, it's only after the crisis passes, that Tigh is the man that you do not want in command of your fleet, because he's not very political, and he doesn't think like that, and he does drink a little bit too much. So it's relief. this is Jamie's wife, Jamie Bamber's wife, ladies and gentlemen. Lovely lady, lovely actress. Pleasure to work with. It was a pleasure to have her on the show. My DVD is paused once or twice here, so I might be slightly behind the rest of you. I have a Tigh and the medic are on screen right at my moment. Pan off to Tigh. And then we're coming up onto the last flashback here of Tigh in his hotel room. Tigh looks down at Adama. The idea of the door being a recurring motif throughout the show is actually, I think, David Icke's. I was creating this sort of thing in the editing room I was determined to hang on to the flashbacks. I felt, because I did see a cut without any of the flashbacks in the show at all, when you just play the show straight and just as an action piece. And I just felt it lacked heart. I felt it lacked emotional depth. I felt it lacked complexity. You didn't understand what the show was about. And I did like the idea a lot of using the flashbacks stylistically throughout, but we needed a hook. You needed sort of a recurring image that would lead you into these flashbacks. And David's idea was that it's the door. The door is what leads you back in. And that until you get here, you don't realize what the door is. Now, there is a woman lying in the bed behind him, as sharp eyes will note. It's not Ellen. We did cast another actress, and in a longer takes of this, you see that she's very clearly a brunette, because this was not how he met Ellen. The great thing here is this is sort of, there's a definite homage quality of this to Apocalypse Now, which is a brilliant film, one of our all-time favorites, and we certainly wanted to pay respect to that in certain ways with this scene. But it's not the same scene. I mean, they don't put him in the shower and, sober him up. He just goes off and pulls himself together, which for our story is more effective. There was something great about him getting ready to light his own metals on fire, with the lighter fluid. And I wanted to convey this idea that the whole place might go up, but we weren't able to quite convey that. And leading characters don't say this. What leading second in command that you can think of has this sort of, I don't want to command, I'm not up to it, this isn't the way it's supposed to be, I should have died back there. I mean, I think it's true. I think that is what Colonel Tigh really thinks and feels, but it's unusual to see that portrayed in television, that sort of honest kind of, I'm a screw-up and I know it kind of quality to him. And here we're getting ready to go out of the show. There's the big window, which was part of the museum. For those of you who saw the miniseries, they had a museum in here because the ship was getting ready to be decommissioned. Nobody lives in there anymore. Nobody works over there. Nobody's gotten over there anymore to inspect that particular piece of damage. They have other things to do, and they're landing pilots. They have other damage. If they have actual fires in other areas of the ship, they have things to deal with. And here we go. Very cool. And right into the camera. And to be continued. So there you have it. There was Scattered. Thank you for coming along on the ride. And hopefully I'll be talking to you next week on Valley of Darkness. Take care, and I'll talk to you then.